everyone so much for joining us. All that being said, I'm Anna Hoffman from the Microsoft Azure Data team, and I'm also joined by Alain. Alain, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So Alain Dormehl, I'm a principal PM in the Azure SQL engineering team, and I look after sort of various sort of different things. One of which is the monitoring portfolio for SQL, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I think we're pretty lucky to have Alain always. I'm really just going to be more like a guide, and when I ask the questions, we're also looking at your questions, I should mention. I do have that up, so whenever you all have questions, put them in the chat and we'll be able to answer them. Today we're going to be talking first about the current monitoring experience that we have today in Azure for Azure SQL, and then we're going to get into Azure SQL Insights, which is kind of like the new stuff, the good stuff, and then we're going to talk about getting started, and maybe we can convince Alain to share some info about futures. So let's get started and talk about the current monitoring experiences for SQL. And before we do that, we thought it would be nice to just give a reminder overview of what we're talking about when we talk about Azure SQL. And there's really three main deployment options when we talk about Azure SQL. And the reason for this is just to meet you wherever you are in that digital transformation type of journey. The first option, so we're going to go from least management by us being Azure to most management by us being Azure. The first deployment option is SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's just SQL Server running on a virtual machine. So you pick the OS, you pick the version, you can run anything basically that you could run on-prem in your SQL Server virtual machine. You get 100% compatibility. We do some things for you. For example, we can do some automated security updates. We can give you a nice view in the portal for kind of managing your SQL virtual machine. And we can help with things like Azure Hybrid Benefits. So there's lots of reasons we see customers moving towards SQL Server and Azure VM. One big reason is if they need access to the OS. This is kind of the only Azure SQL offering that's going to give you that. Now, if you say, I don't need access to the OS, I want more of a managed service, then Azure SQL Managed Instance is going to abstract away that level of the OS, but still give you access to those instance scope capabilities. So if you're using things like DTC, Service Broker, Database Neo, Machine Learning Services, SQL Server Agent, all those things, you're still going to get an Azure SQL Managed Instance, but you're also going to get the benefits of a platform as a service like an SLA and some other insights that we can give you. And then finally, if you just want a database, that's where Azure SQL Database comes into the picture. This is just a database, so you don't get a lot of those instance scope capabilities, but you do get to take advantage of some of our latest innovations, including things like hyperscale, where you can basically scale limitlessly. We say up to 100 terabytes, but it's just a number. And also serverless capabilities. So this idea of auto scaling and auto pausing when you're not using the database. So that's kind of the overview of Azure SQL. And we're going to talk about how you monitor all these different deployment options. But I think it'd be great to kind of remind ourselves about traditional monitoring. And I'm going to pass to Alain to tell us more about what exactly is traditional monitoring.
Sure. So thanks, Anna. That's sort of a good introduction. I think the important piece is to understand is that like a lot of our customers traditionally have sort of a very sort of long line of usage where SQL is concerned. So most people who are using SQL in Azure today are coming from some type of SQL background where they were either running it in their own data center or in some sort of other managed or hosted environment at least. And in sort of your traditional SQL world, SQL is an extremely complex product where sort of its observability suite is concerned. In the sense that there's just so many different things that you have to keep track of, right? Like, and I mean, a big part of this is why we've sort of seen the sort of the entire sort of subcategory of careers, which is the DBAs, sort of spawn up from this, because it is a very complex system to manage and maintain and monitor and all of these things. And a lot of sort of what Microsoft has done over the last 20, 25 years in this space has been, how do we accurately present all this data to customers so that they can consume it and sort of action out, like, well, how do I improve my environment? How do I make data-driven decisions on infrastructure expansions and sort of things like that. So SQL as a product and SQL Server now specifically, very complex in this space, right? So where SQL Server is concerned, you have to concern yourself with the host, right? So the actual infrastructure that I'm running SQL on has its own set of telemetry, the OS that it's running on, which today SQL supports either Linux-based or Windows-based deployments. You have a bunch of sort of telemetry that comes out of your OS as well. And then SQL Server itself has a sort of these three major components to how we present up the telemetry within SQL. And sort of, I guess, the one that people are the most familiar with is the DMVs that we have. So those are dynamic management views. And essentially what these are is you can think of them as sort of snapshots in time of what's going on in the database. So like, how much CPU are you consuming? How much disk space are you consuming? And these DMVs can actually be queried from the SQL surface area using T-SQL. The second one from SQL is X events. So X events are more of a log-based sort of way of presenting up telemetry. And really what happens with an X event is a trigger to something that has happened. So customers can set up their own X events for things that they are interested in sort of knowing about, and they can set up the cadence for when these things sort of will emit out. And pretty much the things that are important where X events are concerned is really what happens is when an X event is triggered inside of SQL writes down to the local disk, or at least this is the default behavior. It writes down to the local disk in sort of this thing that's called an XCL file. And that XCL file is just a log that sort of tells you this has happened and this is potentially why it's happened, right? So X events tend to be a lot more verbose in nature. Like DMVs are very sort of snapshotty, like metrics type of thing. So it's generally numbers with dimensions attached to them. And then sort of the last one we get is error logs, and error logs are really, trying to explain to you why something broke or why something behaved the way that it did. So from a SQL perspective, you kind of have to take all of these things into account to try and sort of troubleshoot, what's going on. And that's just within the SQL world, right? So for example, a good example is like, if you see disk throttling that's taking place on SQL running on a VM, for example, SQL will tell you that the disk is, so you have these high wait times on disk. But then you have to go look at the OS and the host to understand that, hey, the reason my weights have increased is because there was throttling on the disk or something like that. So it's a complex system with a lot of moving parts, a lot of interactions that take place. And then sort of to kind of compound that even like somewhat further, you have to worry about things like the network and the applications that are running against the SQL database, right? So if you have like a transaction-based system that has like 1,000 users on it, it's very plausible that one of the sort of reasons why something could be slow is either the network or the way the app's been written or any of those sort of things. So this entire ecosystem, I guess, gives you a picture of sort of what an end-to-end sort of monitoring story would look like for sort of traditional and modern SQL DBAs. The other one that's not on this list, and sort of this is a lot of people always complain when we don't include this, is SQL Server itself has this sort of set of products which allow you to profile things. So you can sort of go in and you can tag transactions and trace them through the engine and profile them. And a lot of that stuff we'll sort of discuss as we move into the cloud things, why, potentially there are these sort of gaps. But it's important to understand where we come from, to understand where we're sort of going and how we're trying to improve in this space. And really that's where a lot of the SQL Insight stuff will sort of come into play. So what I'll do now is I'm going to sort of talk about what the monitoring experience looks like today in Azure. And what I'm going to try to do here as best as possible is we sort of draw comparisons to what people are used to versus what we've tried to do in Azure. Now, the big difference here is that like if you're running SQL in your own data center, the assumption here is that you're going to have some way of collecting this data, aggregating this data out. And for many years, our ISVs have done a really good job at sort of providing products in this space, or customers have done a really good job at sort of building their own custom solutions to do this in their own data centers. And then sort of in the Azure space, because of a lot of the compliance things and how we deploy some of our PaaS-based products inside of Azure, there is this complexity that exists around, what is your data versus what is my data, and all of the sort of compliance and PII pieces that go around that. Now, in a PaaS-based deployment, customers are running their SQL on Microsoft-owned infrastructure. So that adds a bunch of complexity around, how do we securely sort of transmit data from our backend into customer front end and sort of ensure the fidelity of that data. And there's just a host of things that we have to consider when trying to move this data. But having said that, all of the deployments that we have within the Azure space have at least the base functionality of observability, which is DMVs. You can access those for all of them. X events are there to an extent for almost all of our deployments, but there's a lot of complexity that lives in X events, especially where custom X events are concerned, because as I said earlier, the thing with X events is when an X event gets triggered, it actually writes a physical file down to the local disk that you then have to somehow pick up and interpret. Now, because the infrastructure belongs to Microsoft, customers don't have access to that local disk. So you can kind of see this complexity as it unfolds in sort of the PaaS world where observability is concerned. So a lot of what we've had to do is like think of compliant and safe and secure and performant ways to move this data, given that our PaaS deployment is probably arguably the largest SQL Server farm in the world, right? So it's a very complex problem for Microsoft to try and solve. So in the cloud space, what you kind of get here is for DMVs, especially when you're trying to aggregate things out of the database level into more of a centralized sort of space. So like I want to monitor 50 resources at the same time. We have this concept of metrics and diagnostic logs. Now, metrics are exactly that, right? A metric by definition is a continuous set of numeric values that have dimensionality attached to them. So you think about something like CPU percentage. It's the percent of CPU I'm consuming at a given point in time, and the dimension for that is the percentage of CPU you're consuming. That's all that a metric is capable of telling you. A metric doesn't have the ability to give you any type of insights into that. So there can't be any verbose explanation that comes with a metric. So for example, if your CPU is running at 95%, a metric's very good at telling you that, but it's very bad at telling you why it's at 95%, right? And that's kind of the sort of the fundamental piece that we have within Azure. So all Azure deployments, whether that's SQL running in an elastic pool, a managed instance, a single DB, and even VMs, have this concept of having metrics that customers can consume from the portal or through some type of API surface area. The second big one that we have is diagnostics logs. And essentially what diagnostic logs are is it's a pathway that was built for the data where sort of verbose information is required. So things like X events, error logs, all of these things. How do we move those logs from the local machines into a customer-owned environment so the customer can consume these logs and sort of do something with them, right? So the metrics and the logs kind of go hand in hand. Hey, my CPU is running at 95%. Logs can potentially tell me why I'm running at 95%. And both of these options are available out of the box for all of our Azure-based deployments. And that's sort of how we've tried to map them, right? Like, so if you think back to traditional SQL, you have DMVs, X events, error logs. We've sort of said, hey, DMVs and metrics are kind of a thing. And then diagnostic logs and X events and error logs are kind of like the same thing. So that's how you should think about where different sets of data will come in the PaaS-based world. However, having
Alain,
said that, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we got we got a question on a topic you had mentioned earlier, and I thought, because I think it plays into why we've decided what we've decided for the future. But the question was, hi, there are a lot of tools out there in the market for monitoring. Why doesn't Microsoft include one in like the SQL Server Enterprise Edition? Is there a showstopper? Monitoring is very required. Shouldn't it have been kind of built in? That's kind of the comment.
It's a good question, and like the thing is, I think the answer to that question sort of precedes my time on this portfolio, but I'll give you a perspective on what it is, right? So if you look at our sort of traditional monitoring portfolio, SQL has always provided a set of products that was available to customers to consume, sort of, or at least explore the data that comes out in its telemetry formats. And whether that was through something like SQL Profiler, or whether that was just using SSMS and DMVs, or whatever the case may be, right? Like there was always this sort of baseline of tools that we offered customers. But what we had realized sort of, I guess, fairly early on in the journey was that every single customer does this differently, right? Like there is, I mean, I've been on this space for 3 years now, and I've probably spoken to over 1,000 customers, and I can't tell you of 2 customers that have exactly the same set of requirements, right? Like a lot of customers have these very niche and nuanced ways of how they want to see data, how they want data presented, and all of these different things. So what SQL Server had done really, really well was sort of building this ecosystem of observability where our partners could really sort of engage on, right? And that's where you sort of see the advent of a lot of really popular ISVs that have brought products to market that do a really good job at sort of like offering specific things that customers wanted. And that's kind of a lot of the same mentality that we went into the Azure space was like, you know, building an end-to-end solution is not necessarily sort of the number one priority we're going to deal with. What we do want to deal with is having this platform that enables people, right? And you'll see when we cover SQL Insights, that's exactly what we're trying to build, right? Like we're trying to build this platform that has an ecosystem where, you know, if you want to look at this set of data this way and someone else wants to look at it a different way, and, you know, person number 3 wants to do reporting or alerting in a different way, the platform should enable that, right? And I think that's a lot of what we've tried to move to. You know, I don't think we are in a position today, and probably not in the near future either, to say we have an end-to-end solution that customers can deploy out of the box. But I do believe we can quite comfortably tell customers that, like, hey, there is this platform that enables you to go and sort of interrogate this data in a way that you're comfortable with. Because like I mean, if you look at the ISV space and the OSS space, there are thousands of products available there. For us to try and replicate all of that functionality so that a migration story becomes easy for a customer is almost an impossible task. So instead of trying to do that, you know, having a platform where ISVs can easier integrate, or customers can easier build the things they want on the platforms they want, that's more what we're sort of aiming for. And I hope that answers the question, right? So it's not exactly, I guess, the question you were, or the answer you were hoping for, but that's how we look at this, right? Like having this platform is more important to us than offering end-to-end, the end-to-end story for every little niche use case that customers could have. And sort of with that, I'll sort of move back onto the slides here, but you know, we sort of covered what metrics do and what diagnostic logs do within the Azure space. But up and above that, there's an additional set of complexity that we have to think about. And I sort of did mention it in the previous slides. And you sort of think about the deployments within Azure where you have SQL running on an Azure VM and you have our PaaS-based deployments. Now, these are 2 very different environments, right? And fundamentally, how you should think about these is like, The VM-based environment is customer-owned VM in customer-owned network with customer-owned storage running SQL. So it's almost identical to what customers have in their own data centers today. That poses a bunch of complexity for Microsoft in that Microsoft has a whole host of compliance and PII and sort of these sort of SOC certificates and things about how we deal with customer data. And pretty much one of the big no-nos for us is like, we don't go into customer VMs and we certainly don't interrogate customer workloads. So just based off of that tenant, Microsoft and the SQL group, generally speaking, we don't even know what's running on that VM. Could be SQL, it could be Notepad. We don't know because we don't go into the VM and check, right? So that part of it, because the customer owns the environment, sort of makes things really complex around, well, how do we centralize an observability story for a customer that has 1,000 SQL VMs deployed in Azure? And I mean, we've made a lot of really good progress here with sort of the SQL VM RP registrations and things like that, where customers give us a sort of permission to some extent to gather, whether it's host or OS or SQL-based telemetry and sort of aggregate it into a customer-owned storage account. Some of those things we do, but really, a lot of SQL VM you should think about as traditional deployments as well, right? Like you can still run your ISV solutions that you had on-prem. You can still log into the VM and get and have access to the logs on the local disk, see the OS content, see all of that data is still available to you. So the experience from what you're used to on-prem to running in SQL VM should be very similar. As I said, we've made good progress in terms of like trying to aggregate that and offer products that integrate back up into Azure, but also limited in that, we don't necessarily own that. And there's also nothing that forces a customer to register a SQL VM with the SQL VM RP, right? So there is that level of complexity. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you have platform-based deployments where observability is concerned. And this is exactly the opposite problem. Now, all of a sudden, you have SQL running on Microsoft-owned infrastructure, generating what is, as far as GDPR and all of these sort of other things concerned, customer data. Your telemetry is part of your customer data. So how we then start emitting these things from our environment into yours, doing that safely, doing that securely, abiding by all compliance regulations, all privacy sort of things, is a challenge, right? And we'll sort of look at that when we do the first demo. The second thing to keep in mind is that like our team, the engineering team that me and Anna sit in, millions, like we look after millions and millions and millions of databases, right? Like it's a huge fleet. So just the sheer scale of trying to sort of have infrastructure and maintaining how we do this and what's available and sort of all of those things, there's a lot of complexity that lives in this space, purely because you sort of flip the paradigm from, hey, this is all owned by you to, hey, this is now all owned by Microsoft. And sort of with that, we're sort of just kind of going to unpack a little bit sort of what the sort of major pieces are that we think about when we talk about the telemetry in Azure, and really sort of where SQL Insights is concerned. I can share this on here because it's fairly public knowledge by now. SQL Insights will be able to deploy in some type of hybrid format, which means we'll be able to collect data from on-prem deployments and things like that up into Azure. So a lot of this is applicable there, but we've sort of broken down what we consider to be the observability stack into kind of these, I guess, these 5 major pieces, right? And this is where a lot of that freedom to customer sort of thing comes from, right? Like this is what I was saying earlier, having a platform that provides all of these capabilities is what we believe is really sort of key to having customers adopt this, right? So the first thing is the source of data that we collect from. So today within Azure, and let's just include on-prem for argument's sake here, there is a plethora of different types of SQL that you can be collecting data from. Just if you look on-prem, it's everything from, I don't know what the latest supported version is. I think it's 2012 up to 2019, I think is the newest one, right? So there's a host of sort of additions of SQL there that you have to concern yourself with. Within the Azure space, you've got managed instance, you've got SQL DB, you've got elastic pools, and all of these products are inherently slightly different, right? Like if you think about what each product is, they are supposed to be different, right? Like managed instance is a scoped instance of SQL. So you have access to the full instance, you have access to all the telemetry aggregated at the instance level. But more importantly, in managed instance, your resource allocation actually sits at the instance. So when you look at things like CPU percentage inside, that is the consumed CPU across all databases inside the managed instance that you're looking at. Whereas with single database, it's a single resource. And if you look at CPU percentage, it is the usage of CPU in that one database, right? So the scope of those deployments differ, which means the telemetry we can collect differs. The sort of the way we present some of that telemetry is different, whereas like, managed instance has this nested effect where it's instance and database and schema, that kind of thing. Whereas SQL DB, it's database schema, right? So there's one less layer to worry yourself with. And then in elastic pools, you kind of reintroduce the complexity, except in a different way, where it's not actually an instance because you can't query across the multiple databases inside an elastic pool, but now all of a sudden you have a resource container with multiple DBs in it. So just the way that the data gets, sort of what data gets collected and what data gets presented up has its own complexities as well, where Azure is concerned. Then sort of the other thing that we consider to be very important here is the collection of data. So what data do we actually collect? As I mentioned before, that differs per deployment type. So in managed instance, you care about instance level things. In SQL DB, you absolutely don't, right? So it's just like those intrinsic sort of things. But also very important here is the frequency and the latency of the collection, right? In the existing experiences, metrics and diagnostic logs, you as a customer don't have any control over that. We build the ingestion pipelines for the metrics and the diagnostic logs, and they will emit based on what we've engineered them to do. Whereas with sort of where we're trying to move in the future is we're trying to give customers all of these knobs to turn. So if you want to collect data at like a 5-second interval, you can, right? You'll be allowed to do those things now. The third one is the storage. So where does all of this data get stored? We've done a lot of work here. We've sort of looked at what the industry is busy doing. We actively participate in like the open telemetry initiatives by the CNCF. We sort of have been paying a lot of attention to how some of the up and coming developer technologies are looking at these sort of things. And pretty much the big ones here is just, we need a way to be able to provide customers freedom of choice here. So if you want to go store this data in raw storage and then somehow consume it up into an existing product that you might have on-prem, that's a pattern that we see, but we need to be able to enable that. If you want to ingest this data into a Microsoft first-party product like Log Analytics to be able to visualize it in the Azure portal, you should be able to do that. If you want to be able to ingest this into a time series engine like ADX and then use Grafana to visualize the data, you should be able to do that. So these are the type of things we're thinking about where these options are concerned. The consumption piece is also, similar to the storage. We want to give customers options on how they consume their data, right? You should be able to integrate the data easily, either from a queue system into an existing product or, visualize it directly in the Azure portal, which is a lot of what we're going to look at today. Or use your own tools, right? Like if you want to use Power BI, if you want to use Grafana, we shouldn't be stopping you from making those type of decisions. We should be enabling all of that. And this goes back to the whole, like the platform thing. And then sort of the last one is the packaging. It's just how easy is all of this to do. It should just be click, click, deploy. And that's really where we're trying to move. We're trying to move to a place where, you have full fidelity with like ARM. You can deploy all of this through ARM. You can integrate with PowerShell. There should be an API surface area that you can easily sort of call. All of those are kind of the big things that we're focusing on as we move forward with the monitoring portfolio. And with that, I'm going to jump into my first demo, which I think is this screen. Yeah. So let me sort of start off with the setup here so that you understand what exactly is going on here. Here, we're sort of looking at the sort of a subscription that I'm part of. And this is just a single resource group that is in the subscription. But what you can kind of see here is there is an Azure SQL logical server here. And under this logical server, we have a variety of sort of different databases that have been deployed. Some of them are in elastic pools, some of them are single databases, some of them are general purpose, some of them are business critical. So we have a sort of a good variety of things. There is a key vault here for storing our secrets, for accessing it, and you'll kind of see when we get to the last bit why that's important. But really sort of what I'm going to look at in this demo are more of the traditional things that are available. Anna will sort of focus a bit more on SQL Insights, but I'll sort of cover the what do we have today. So if you look at this, here's the logical server. I'm going to sort of just focus on a single database here. And you'll see here under the monitoring pieces, we have kind of the two major ones that I've discussed already, and that's metrics and diagnostic settings. So diagnostic settings are basically just how do you want to set up the flow of these logs. As I said, there's an entire workflow at the back end that goes and collects the files from the local disk, aggregates them, moves them to custom environment. And you as customer get sort of choices around how you want this data to sort of move. And the choices that we offer you today is you can either send that data into a log analytics workspace. You can either send it to a storage account, in which case it's pretty much just like flat text log files that sit in the storage account for consumption by another product. You can stream those into event hubs, or there are certain partners that we have integration with today where you can sort of stream this data directly into a partner-based solution. And again, there's a number of sort of different types of data here. You can sort of get SQL Insights things. You can get the auto tuning information here. You can get database weight statistics, sort of all of the, I guess, the major pieces that customers are concerned with. You can sort of flow through diagnostic logs here. And I'll sort of show you how we explore that in a bit. The other sort of big one that we have is the metrics. Now, here from the portal, if I come and I access metrics, you'll see there is a predefined list of metrics that I get to look at, right? One of the things with metrics, as I said, because this is a PaaS-based deployment, customers can't specify their own metrics, right? They can only consume the metrics that we emit for them. So if we kind of look at this one and we say, okay, we want to look at CPU percentage, and then there you can kind of see how the CPU goes up. This server is not super active, so it's not doing much, but you can see it has reasonable granularity and kind of the CPU is going up and down, up and down. And you can choose how you want to view this data. Do you want to view the max on the CPU percent? Do you want to view the min? And this all kind of renders in real time in the Azure portal. The other thing that's important to understand about the metrics is metrics can also be consumed through the Azure Monitor API endpoints. So if you want to programmatically consume this data, not through the portal because you have 500 databases, you can do that by querying the Azure Monitor APIs the whole time, right? But here I'm sort of going to show you how this would look if you had multiple databases. So if I come and I select my Azure SQL databases and I select my region and I apply this, now all of a sudden you can see from the Azure Monitor portion of the portal, I can now start seeing, and if I go look at that same one, I can now start seeing multiple servers, right? So these are all the servers deployed in that subscription in that region. And here you can kind of see their CPU usage. So as sort of a very basic example, like, hey, like there's something of interest for me. Like, why did this one do this jump? What was going on there? But again, because these are metrics, I can't really do any more than that, right? Like I can see that there was an increase in CPU, but I can't see why there was an increase in CPU. And that's kind of really where the logs come in. So again, logs by default, you have to, they run inside of log analytics today. Log analytics uses KQL, which is the Kusto language. Is the same thing that you sort of get in ADX and a lot of these other products. And you can by default visualize data inside of KQL. So here you'll see again, I'm in that same resource group. I've got my log explorer open. And here under SQL Server, I can come and see the metrics that are available, or I can come and see the diagnostic logs. Just run a simple query like this, and you'll see it'll kind of bring back all the logs that are being gathered inside of that resource group for SQL servers. And you can kind of see, okay, this specific one is a database weight stat, and you can see specifically which weight stat it is. So this is like page latch SH. So you have this way of now getting more information. The thing is with these logs, however, is like, because they're time series based and things, you have to be able to somehow write the Kusto query to be able to do something with them as a function of time. But also you have to be able to correlate this back to the metric when you saw a problem. Like, hey, my CPU was running high for this period of time. What are my weight stats showing, right? So it's a multi-step process really, where you have to kind of first identify the problem and then go investigate the problem. I mean, alternatively, the easiest thing here would be to go and log into the database and go query the T-SQL, but that's not always a viable option if you've got 5,000 databases, or if, like a lot of the customers I deal with, they do separation of responsibilities, right? So a customer that can view things on the portal might not ever be able to log into the database to query it directly. So that's why a lot of these like aggregation functions exist within Azure today. And then sort of the last thing that I'm going to show here is that, and this is a very important part of the observability stack where customers are concerned, at least, is this ability for you to be able to create alerts on top of this. So a classic example is, I would like to get alerted when a database is running at 95 CPU for more than 5 minutes, right? Send me an email or send me a text message. And you can do that quite easily on top of the alerts, as well as the logs that are available. So you can sort of see, you can sort of specify here, I would like to, I'd like to be able to get an alert when the average is above 95% for more than 5 minutes, and then evaluate it every minute. The only thing is these alerts, just keep in mind, like they do have a cost with Azure alerting, but all of these will basically aggregate up into your alerting portal, which is sort of a default function that all the products inside of Azure can utilize. So you can imagine this alerting portal, if you set up the correct alerts and things, you could alert on your entire database fleet, right? All your VMs, all your networking things, all in one place. And that's really what this is about, right? It's about aggregating these things. And then you as the customer are supposed to sort of choose which of these are worth sending emails for, who get the emails. And that's really how you should think about it. It should be integrated into your sort of end-to-end monitoring story, which includes the alerting piece, right? A lot of customers also sort of like to use third-party things. So, for example, you can plug Grafana directly on top of log analytics. Grafana has built-in alerting functionality. So, there are options. That's what I was saying earlier. We do want to enable these options for customers. And that's really a big thing that we're driving towards. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's kind of what the metrics and the diagnostic logs and things look like, and how you set up alerts for each of those.
So yeah, I think this has been really interesting, Alain. And we have some questions that I think might highlight, because I think ultimately, like when we get to this point, my biggest question is like, okay, so we have all these things, like what are the challenges, and why does that lead towards something new that we're going to talk about? But there were a few questions. One that seems relatively related to what you were showing. They were saying, let's say we see expensive CPU queries. Will the metrics tool give us info about how to fix the query?
So there's two parts to that. Let's start off with the sort of the underwriting, I guess, no answer to that, and that, like, again, metrics are purely numeric values with associated dimensionality, right? So metric is only going to tell you that the CPU was high. Like, it's not going to tell you that there was a query that was causing the CPU to be high. And this is, I guess, this is fundamentally why we invested in SQL Insights, because there is this gap of like, how do I do that next piece of analysis? And then even past that, how do I do sort of the automated pieces, the intelligent pieces? That's really where SQL Insights is going to come in.
Awesome. So I guess for James, we'll just say, stay tuned. We're about to talk about it.
Yeah. Keep watching. That was another question. I think you said there was a couple.
Oh, there was one more question. I wouldn't say it's necessarily related, but it's a fun question. Victor asked, what page latch weights are an indication of what? And they were thinking TIMDB contention.
Well, I mean, so I'd have to look more specifically at what exactly was going on there. But yes, it could be a number of things. That's one of them.
Yeah, but I think all up, like, it shows like we have these three big capabilities: metrics, alerting, and diagnostic logs. But maybe there's no way to see all these three things together, which is kind of what even James was kind of calling out. But can you tell us, like, give us the inside look at why we came up with Azure SQL Insights?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it is a great segue sort of to sort of the piece we're going on to now. And it is really about closing the gaps, right? Like, we kind of started the session off by looking at what SQL Server was capable of doing. And like, I mean, we spent a good amount of time there, and SQL has this really, like, insanely rich ecosystem of observability that it has had forever, right? And then you kind of move up into Azure, and like, while most of that data is still available, it's hard to access. It's hard to kind of aggregate it out of the PaaS deployments, and there's just a bunch of things that are like, that could be better. And really, that's where SQL Insights sort of came in, right? It's important to understand, though, that metrics, diagnostic logs, alerts, all of the things that we looked at previously, those are functions and features that we offer customers out the box for every deployment. As I said previously as well, DMVs and those things, you can still access those. You can log into the physical SQL box. You can physically go query the DMV. So you can still get access to all the data. It's not like the data is missing. It's just there is no easy way for a customer to consume, let's say, all the metrics for query weight statistics from QDS across 10,000 databases. Like, that's kind of the piece that's missing. Is there's this piece where all the correlation that's required to do these things, all the sort of aggregation into one place is missing. And then also sort of some of the really big things that we felt were really important is because of the nature of Azure, because of how many different products run in Azure, because of how big our SQL estate is inside of Azure, some customers are just not happy with the default frequencies and latencies that are inherent to the metrics and the diagnostic logs. And that's a perfectly acceptable thing, because in your SQL Server world, you could get these things whenever you wanted them. Now in Azure, you're kind of at the behest of like the system and our engineering sort of decisions and things like that. Whereas SQL Insights kind of totally changes that paradigm, and it gives customers all of those freedoms, right? Like, a good example that I always like to use is that, like, SQL Server as a product, if you exclude the host and the OS and all of those things, has 2,000 plus different pieces of telemetry that customers can look at. Metrics and diagnostic logs combined is not even 100 pieces of data. So just from a data collection perspective, there is a significant delta between the two sets of products. Whereas SQL Insights while not covering the full 2,000 pieces of telemetry, is closer to the 1,000 mark, right? So it's a significant jump forward, but it also gives customers all of that freedom. We also understand that, like, not all customers don't want to collect everything all the time, and that's perfectly fine. So what we're going to do is we're kind of going to look at conceptually, like, how does SQL Insights work? And then we'll sort of, from there, we'll move on to something that's, I think Anna's got a really cool demo for us that she's going to do. And then we can just sort of chat about it and answer all the questions that people have. But kind of what you need to think about is think about those sort of 5 pillars that I had, and sort of conceptualize how this would work for you. So the most important thing to understand here is that what we're going to be discussing here, while this is in the context of SQL, it doesn't have to be. This concept is very closely aligned to some of the open telemetry initiatives and things like that. So the concept and sort of the main architectural pieces behind SQL Insights could be used for MySQL. It could be used for things like Nginx, Redis. They could do the OS. They could do the host. You have options here, but we'll focus on the SQL Server specific one. Then you sort of have this sort of layer, and kind of everything to the left of this blue box that says Workload Insights Platform kind of runs on top of the Workload Insights Platform. And really, sort of, as I said, a big part of what customers want to be able to do is have the ability to package these things. So how do I deploy? How do I interact? How do I do this easily? And how do I do this at scale? So there's a portal-based experience for how you deploy. This can all be done through ARM. You can deploy through the marketplace. So, all the sort of traditional things that customers would expect will be available for SQL Insights. We then kind of move on to the collection piece. And this is really the most interesting piece, is the data that we collect. So we use the Azure Monitor agent today with the Workload Insights collection service. And then what we've actually done is we've actually used an open source collection repo. So the input plugin for Telegraph for SQL, it's open source. Any customer can go look at the data that we collect. And we run it on top of this platform. And this platform basically enables us to then take that data, transform it, move it into customer environment. And there's full transparency around what data we're collecting, how often we collect it, what do the queries look like, what do the aggregations look like? Because that's another big sort of complaint that we get, is that, we might show you CPU percentage on the metrics, but customers don't know what the exact calculation is for that percentage number, right? Like, is it actually the percentage over what time period, over what are we looking at? So there is complexity even in that aspect of it. Whereas here, there's full transparency in like what exactly the calculation there is. And then sort of we have this concept, and we'll look, we can sort of discuss that in a bit of detail here, which is called a DCR, which is a data collection rule, which is, you can think of that almost as a wrapper, right? So the DCR is almost like think of it as a policy for collection. So you configure the DCR and you say, hey, I want to collect this data from all of these SQL servers, and it will just go and do that. And if you add or remove databases from that environment, it'll automatically go and include them in the monitoring or not include them in the monitoring. So the DCR is really almost like a config layer for, what data to collect, how often to collect it, where to go put the data. All of those things are sort of a function of the DCR. And then from a storage perspective, as I said, today we support log analytics. In the future, we're going to be supporting pushing directly into metrics. We're going to be supporting Azure Data Explorer. We're going to be supporting straight to storage. So there are going to be tons of options around where do you want to go store this data. And then sort of the last one that's important here is just the consumption piece. And this is like, well, how does the customer consume all of these things, right? So today, the experience that we're going to look at is specifically the Azure Monitor workbooks, but really there's nothing. In fact, we have customers that do it today. You can use Grafana to consume the data. You can use Power BI to consume the data. It doesn't really matter what your choice is. the platform itself will enable you to kind of consume this data in a way that you're comfortable with consuming it. Like that's the key thing you need to take away. So pretty much the I guess the biggest points here are just understanding that within this sort of deployment framework, right? Like you deploy this agent that's here, they're called the Azure Monitor agent, which basically which is comprised of all of these components, right? Like this is a very detailed graph of what goes on there, but just think about it as a deployed agent that will go and do all of this for you across your SQL estate, right? And it is then controlled by this policy, the DCR, that tells the agent what to collect, where to put it, and all of those things that are relevant. So you as customer now have complete control over how frequently you collect data, what data you collect, the retention policies on top of that data. You can choose how you sort of consume the data. And again, this is all sort of just integrated on top of an existing open source solution that a lot of people in SQL are familiar with, right? So really what we've built here is sort of the beginning pieces of this platform that I was describing earlier, which is like, hey, like we want to give you an environment where you're collecting all the data you need and you have all the tools that you need to sort of answer the questions that are important in your environment. Because again, the thousands of customers I've spoken to, none of them have the same requirements, right? So just giving them the tools to do these things is kind of really the sort of the big thing that we're trying to drive here, right? So some of the major benefits that SQL Insights is going to bring is, you're going to now be able to start doing things like cross-service correlations. So you think about the example we used earlier where, for example, there's a throttling event that's taking place. You can now go pull metrics and telemetry from storage, combine them with metrics and telemetry from SQL, and sort of correlate like, hey, SQL's slowing down. Is this a problem inside SQL with my queries, or is this something else? Now you can start doing these correlations across different products. The other major point here is that for the first time, we now have a tool that allows you to monitor across all of our deployment types. We didn't have this before. Previously, the expectation was that you monitored VMs and PaaS separately, right? Now we're saying, hey, like it doesn't really matter. It could be SQL running in Azure. In the future, it could be SQL running in your own DC. It could be SQL running in Arc if you wanted at some point, we hope. And you'll be able to aggregate all this data up into a centralized place and start sort of building those, I guess, one pane of glass to monitor an entire estate across its complexity. For this entire deployment, you get to define what the frequency of collection is. You get to define what data gets collected within each deployment type. So you'll sort of see that like you can choose different data sets for VM to what you have for DB to what you have for MI, like if that's how you wanted to collect the data. The other very big thing here, and again, it goes back to the point that I made about the PaaS things, this entire deployment sits in customer subscription. So these like the problems with PII and compliance and all of that go away because the data lives and is secured inside your subscription, not inside ours anymore. You have access to alerting, so all of this is fully integrated into the Azure alerting platforms. You can still create alerts, except now, where previously your alerting capabilities were limited to the 100 odd data points that were available inside of metrics and diagnostic logs, you now have access to the hundreds and hundreds of different data points that SQL Insights is collecting. In the future, we'll provide sort of capabilities for you to be able to sort of run some type of intelligence over this. So you think about the auto tuning things and all of that, those are not going away, but like you might have an environment now where we could start releasing these things to be more bespoke to specific customers, or you could have an environment where you could do your own machine learning to sort of try solve common type of performance issues. There's a lot of automation here. So what we've seen customers do with this is, some customers monitor workloads and automate like the scaling up and scaling down of their SQL DBs. So like all of that is possible because you're fully integrated with the Azure ecosystem. And then just lastly, kind of all the power kind of sits with the customer in this with a solution, right? Like you have access to pretty much everything. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'll stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Anna. We got a demo for SQL Insights.
All right, thanks, Alain. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Great. Okay, yeah, so what we're going to do now is kind of take a look at an end-to-end scenario of how we're kind of combining these three things that we've been talking about: alerting, metrics, and diagnostics in one kind of end-to-end example, and show how you can actually go about getting actionable insights with SQL Insights. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start by using kicking off a workload. So I'm using OStress here to just simulate a workload on Azure SQL database that I have. And we'll see that it will complete. I think it takes usually like 30 to 45 seconds to complete. But let's say this completes and we notice that this workload is taking a little bit too long for us, right? So what we want to do is we want to be able to go investigate it and using Azure SQL Insights to figure out, hey, what's going on, what database, or how can we make this run faster, essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the Azure Monitor View in the Azure portal. And full disclosure, this is recorded, so I can pause and stuff. But a few things I wanted to call out here on this main page of SQL Insights is that I get to pick a monitoring profile. I get to pick a time range. So these are things I can have different monitoring profiles for maybe different workloads or different applications. And I can even see in the overview, I'm able to kind of look across this data estate that I have for this profile. So databases, managed instances, SQL servers on virtual machines. Even if I had some availability groups, I would be able to see that. The other thing I can do is I can configure alerts and see if alerts have been fired right from here. So now we're kind of bringing this view in. You can see I have a few alerts that have been fired because of high CPU. And actually setting up these alerts is really easy because we have some pre-configured templates, and even customizing them like Alain showed earlier is also something that's possible. Now, let's say I want to dive into something. So here I'm going to dive into databases. And this is going to allow me to see all of the databases across all the servers in that kind of view that I've set up. So you can see I have a bunch of AdventureWorks databases, and even my geo replicas are going to show up as secondaries here. Now I can then go into like resource info and see kind of at a high level view across all of my databases, what's going on from a CPU perspective, from memory, data IO, even the log IO, and I can dive in. Here's where I'm going to pause because I just go a little too fast. But here under activities, you can see there's lots of different blades among the top, and under activities, I can start to see how, each of these databases across all of those servers, so kind of one view, are performing. And if I want to click into one, I can, and you can see, and this is just the default view, right? So default, I'm able to see the user connections, batch requests per second, SQL compilations, and maybe see that orange spike is something I might want to go look into that I might not know about otherwise. But the nice thing about all this is that it is customizable. So up at the top left, you can see this edit button. So you can go in and edit. You can customize each of these charts to show what you want to show and what's going to be relevant for your use case. So again, we're taking into account that customers want to be able to customize this. Just looking at some of the other blades, we also have transactions where you can see what's going on, how it's performing. And this is my favorite one. You can kind of pick whatever you want. And here's where you're really able to see all those different options that we have available for you to kind of monitor. And I think this is a good place to kind of explore and then see what you might want to add to your own custom workbook. So now that we've kind of taken a look at what's available overall for all of these databases, I think we'll go back to the scenario and take a look at which database is being throttled. And it's pretty obvious at this view that, that one is having some potentially CPU issues. So here in this view, you can see, I've actually customized this to be able to see the maximum of CPU utilization. And you can see over time, we're kind of hitting that maximum CPU percentage pretty frequently. So that might be something we want to click into. What's great about this is we can go kind of dive into it from here, and we can see the things like the SQL weight categories in one view. So now I have this view that allows me to see, okay, like let's dive into the next level, not just CPU is high, but why is CPU high? And so we can see we are actually getting a weight on CPU. And if you click that, we can go one level deeper. And this is where it gets really cool. And we can see what CPU related weight type we're actually getting. And here you can see we're getting an SOS scheduler yield weight, which is typically indicative that we're being throttled by CPU. So this is a relatively simple example, but it is an example that shows you how we're able to get to the root of the issue. And now we can go and address it. And in this case, it's kind of a simple addressment. We're just going to go and we're going to scale up our database so it has more CPU. But you could see other scenarios here where you would be able to diagnose other things and go from the metric you're seeing to the weight type or some other issue that might be going on. So now that we've scaled up, again, I just sped that up a little. We can run that same workload again. Remember, the first time it ran in about 45 seconds. And this second time it's running in about 13 seconds. And we can go back in real time and just kind of refresh our dashboard and hopefully see that, sure enough, the CPU utilization has gone down for that workload. So this is a really kind of simple example, but a few things that I want to highlight here is that it's very customizable, and it's also bringing together all of these different services that were kind of previously in separate places. Any other things you wanted to point out from kind of this view, Elaine?
No. I think that's a fantastic overview. I mean, there's just the setup stuff, but I mean, there's very good documentation. People can look at the resources. Yeah, I think that was fantastic. Thanks.
Great. So I did want to call out, there is a question, I think it's a little bit unrelated to what we're talking about now. So maybe we'll just hold on that one to the end. But just from a resources perspective, there's really just one main resource, and that's aka.ms/Azure SQL Insights. I'm actually going to pull that up really fast. And what's great about this is Elaine mentioned like the getting started process is not something we necessarily included in that demo, but if you go into this, you can see all the details about what we were talking about today. And if you go into the enable section, you're going to see, your two friends again, we're here. I got Elaine on a data exposed video, and he walks us through how to actually set this thing up. So how to configure your connection strings. And it's nice because it's integrated with Azure Key Vault, so you don't have to put any passwords or anything like that into it. And it's very cool. This is a very great video. I would definitely, if your next step is to go play with this, come to this page, come to aka.ms/Azure SQL Insights and check it out. And then you'll be able to kind of see how to get all this up and running. And, we'd love your feedback. So play with this, see what you think, let us know what you think. It is in public preview today. Any teasers, Elaine, you want to give for folks for what you're working on next?
Our big one is the GA, right? Like, so moving this product into general availability is our big next thing. I kind of think like a lot of what we're going to see between now and then is just improvements in sort of the manageability of this. Like there are today within the preview sort of scope, there are limitations on, how many agents can monitor how many SQLs. And we're sort of putting in a lot of effort around how we're going to be sort of managing that experience for customers, right? So that customers don't have to worry about the agents, don't have to worry about scaling the agents, or none of that needs to be customer worry. So that's really a lot of what we're focusing on. We will be landing the full set of QDS data as well. So while the demo that Anna showed you sort of ended at weight statistics, the QDS data will be landing in the preview probably in the next, I'd say 6 weeks to 8 weeks kind of thing. Once QDS is there, you'll be able to really kind of do like very specific query analysis on, what are my top 5 resource consuming queries? What are my top 5 longest running queries, right? And you can do this either at a database level or at an estate level, right? So like you have all of those flexibilities once that data lands. So yeah, really, like there's a lot of really cool things we're working on at the moment. As I said, we are sort of working, or at least we are contributing into the open telemetry stuff, so that there's a lot of exciting things that we're talking about where sort of developer interactions come into play, but nothing we can share in public just yet. But just know that this is a space that we're investing in, and this is sort of really a space that I'm passionate about, and the team that I work with is passionate about. So it's super exciting for us, and yeah, we hope the GA comes sooner rather than later.
Yeah, definitely. And I would agree with that. I'm very excited about this and excited about the GA and excited about some of the things I've heard about the future. There was a quick question in the chat, and I'm glad you mentioned the QDS because there was a question earlier and I wanted to make sure that we circled back on it, but you basically answered it. Someone did ask about if this new solution has a cost associated with this or if it's free.
Sure. So I'm happy to answer that question. So pretty much what people need to understand is like we spent a lot of the session kind of discussing what are the options you have today. So metrics, diagnostic logs, those things are not going anywhere. We'll continue to support those for all of our deployments, and customers will continue to have access for them. SQL Insights is kind of like, we see this as like the monitoring plus tool. Having said that, though, we're not going to be billing customers a premium here for this service. There's no like additional cost that you gotta cover. The only thing that you will get billed for here is the compute to run the agent, which is tiny, and then the storage for actually storing this data inside of whatever storage engine you land up choosing. So there will be those additional costs just for like getting the data and then storing it, but there won't be a premium, at least not in the current plans, at least for this service. Once we start introducing perhaps some additional like value added things that are only available in the Azure-based deployments, maybe, but again, those are just discussions at the moment. Right now, all you've got to concern yourself with is there will be a small compute cost and some storage cost for the actual telemetry.
Awesome, thanks. Hopefully that answers your question. There was one more question as we close out. Again, I'm not sure it's directly related to our topic, but the question was, I find it very hard to go through the monitoring logs for Azure PaaS from Log Analytics Workspace. Is there a pre-built set of scripts that can be used or complete KQL documentation for monitoring SQL? I'll start and then I'll let you chime in, Alain. But there is like great documentation on KQL, and one resource I find really helpful, which I'm just going to share there, is the documentation for the SQL to KQL cheat sheet. That's been really useful for me as I try to learn KQL. It is pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it, I feel like. And there is a complete set of docs associated with it. But Alain, any other tips you might have?
Yeah, so I mean KQL is kind of the Microsoft preferred way for you to consume these things through Log Analytics. But I mean, as we've mentioned, like, today Log Analytics is the default place for you to store data, but it's not going to be forever, right? Like, you can store the data in flat storage at some point. We're going to support ADX, which is also KQL, but slightly easier, slightly more sort of KQL that has a lot more freedom to it. So customers will have a lot of those choices, but I also just want to point out, like, all the workbook, all the visualizations and all the content inside the workbook that sort of Anna ran through. I mean, you can click on the little Log Analytics button at the top of every single visualization, and it'll actually bring up the KQL query that we're using to generate that graph. And you can then either modify it or just use it the way it is. I mean, the default experience that Anna showed is available out the box for all customers, and it's It's fully published on the Log Analytics or the Azure Monitor GitHub. So you can go see the physical JSON and the queries that are running there. You can go see all of them, modify them, change the visualizations if you want, or you can use a different visualization engine that doesn't rely on KQL, right? Like Grafana is a good example. You can go use Grafana if you want, and kind of if you're more comfortable with that, you can consume the data through that. Again, it's all about the freedom of how you're getting this data. We don't want to force you to use KQL if you don't think it's right for you.
We have a follow-up question from Tony. Says, in the future, will it be possible to store the log data in an Azure SQL database and query it with SQL?
Anything is possible. It's the first time I've heard that request. So maybe we'll add it to our list of things that maybe we should be looking at. But I can say, like, I mean, there's nothing that stops us from doing something like that potentially within this ecosystem. But kind of like re-ingesting the data back into SQL is not currently on the roadmap. Like I said, I haven't heard that request yet. ADX, Azure Data Explorer, is like super, like, it's the #1 we get requested. And then just flat storage, right? Because a lot of our customers have existing products that can consume logs, that can do these things that they've been using on-prem. So, you know, a lot of customers just want to stay with familiar things for now, and that's fine. So like, we'll push everything into logs, and you can, I don't know, you use Splunk, you can use your ticketing systems, whatever you have, it'll be fine. Like, so that's the intention. It's SQL, maybe, I don't know, we'll see. Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Anna.